He was known for buying companies the way other men bought coffee. No one expected the most expensive decision of Ethan Caldwell's life to happen in a forest no one else cared about. Ethan had built his reputation on precision and control, the kind that turned failing steel plants into billion-dollar assets and boardrooms silent with a single glance. At 42, he was worth more than most small towns in Colorado, and yet he preferred the quiet of his private woodland estate to the noise of Manhattan galas. The forest stretched across 3,000 acres of pine and aspen, a place he kept untouched, except for a narrow dirt trail wide enough for his black SUV. Late October air cut sharp and clean, hovering just above 40 degrees, the kind that made breath visible and thoughts clearer. He told his assistant he needed space. Investors believed he was negotiating another merger. The truth was simpler. He was tired of faces that wanted something from him. In the forest, there were no contracts, no flashing cameras, no analysts predicting his next move. Just wind sliding through branches and the steady crunch of boots against fallen leaves. Ethan walked with his usual measured stride, expensive wool coat tailored perfectly against his 6-foot frame leather gloves, shielding hands that had signed deals worth billions. He did not come here to save anyone. He came here to remember what silence felt like. But silence, he would soon learn, can break in ways louder than any headline. And on that cold afternoon, somewhere beyond the next line of trees, something fragile was waiting to change everything he believed about power, responsibility, and the cost of looking away. 2 miles deeper into the trees, an 8-year-old girl was counting her breaths because she was afraid if she stopped counting, she might stop breathing. Lily Harper had not meant to wander this far. The forest had looked smaller from the edge of the highway, less endless, less cold. She had followed what she thought was a shortcut back toward the service road after hiding when a state trooper pulled over near the gas station where she had been sleeping behind a dumpster. She had learned to hide quickly. Her pink sneakers were soaked through from crossing a shallow creek, no wider than 6 feet, and the temperature had dropped fast as the sun slid lower behind the mountains. 40 degrees felt like winter when you had not eaten a full meal in 2 days. Her thin sweatshirt, once bright yellow, was now dulled by dirt and pine sap. She sat curled beneath a wide pine tree, knees pressed to her chest, trying to remember the last time she felt warm. Her mother had promised everything would be temporary, just a few weeks, just until they found work, just until things got better. But the apartment had disappeared, then the car, and then her mother had disappeared too, taken away in the back of a patrol car after trying to walk out of a grocery store with food she could not afford. Lily did not understand the legal words. She only understood the silence that followed. A dry cough shook her small frame. She pressed her hands against her stomach and whispered to herself that someone would come. Someone always came in the movies. The forest did not answer. The sound reached Ethan before he understood what it was, a thin, uneven cough carried between the trees, like something the wind had almost erased. He stopped mid-step, every instinct trained to analyze risk before emotion. This land was fenced and monitored. No one was supposed to be here. He listened again. At first, there was nothing but the distant rustle of branches shifting high above, then another faint sound, softer this time, almost like a whimper swallowed by cold air. Ethan felt irritation flicker through him. Trespassers meant liability. Liability meant headlines. He turned toward the noise anyway, moving off the narrow trail and into thicker brush where pine needles softened his footsteps. The forest floor dipped gradually, and the temperature seemed to fall with it. After 30 yards, he saw a flash of yellow against the brown and green. For a moment, his mind refused to process the shape. Then it sharpened into the small frame of a child curled beneath a tree. Arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she were trying to hold in the last bit of warmth. She looked impossibly small against the wide trunk behind her. Her eyes were closed, lashes pale against flushed skin, lips slightly parted, as her breathing came shallow and uneven. Ethan did not rush forward. He stood there, 6 feet tall, coat-tailored watch, worth more than a modest home, staring at a reality that did not belong in his controlled world. The forest had been silent for him all afternoon. Now it felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what a billionaire would do when faced with something money could not immediately fix. For a long second, Ethan Caldwell did nothing. His mind moved the way it always did, calculating outcomes instead of feelings. A child alone on private property meant police reports, legal questions, reporters asking how someone had slipped past security. He could call his head of security and have the situation handled in less than 10 minutes. Clean, efficient, distant. The girl shifted slightly, a fragile movement that looked more like surrender than comfort. A quiet sound escaped her lips, not loud enough to be a cry for help, more like a reflex against the cold. Ethan felt something unfamiliar press against his chest. Not panic, not fear, but recognition. This was not a headline. This was a human being, no more than 8 years old, shivering under a pine tree, while the temperature continued to fall. The sun was dropping fast, maybe 30 minutes before the light would thin into early dusk. In October, darkness came quickly in the Colorado mountains. He stepped closer, careful, deliberate, as if approaching a wounded bird. Up close, he could see the details his distance had blurred. Her cheeks were flushed with fever. Her small hands were raw from the cold. Her sneakers were soaked laces dragging in damp pine needles. She did not belong here. No child did. Ethan crouched, the expensive fabric of his coat brushing against the forest floor. He hesitated before reaching out, aware that one touch could shift everything from observation to responsibility. His phone weighed heavily in his pocket. He could still make the call and step back. Instead, he lowered his gloved hand slowly toward her shoulder, pausing just inches away, as if waiting for permission from a world that had never asked his, before making him responsible for anything beyond profit. The forest remained silent, but the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like judgment. His gloved fingers finally touched her shoulder, light at first, as if she might disappear under pressure. The fabric of her sweatshirt was damp and cold. The girl flinched weakly at the contact, her eyelids fluttering open just enough to reveal pale blue eyes clouded by exhaustion. She did not scream. She did not pull away. She looked at him as if she did not have the strength to be afraid. Ethan removed his glove slowly and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. Heat radiated against his skin, unnatural against the crisp mountain air. She was burning with fever while the world around her hovered near 40 degrees. The contradiction unsettled him. "Hey," he said, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used in tense negotiations. "Can you hear me?" Her lips moved before any sound came out. He leaned closer, catching the faint whisper that followed. "Please, do not leave." The words were barely audible, fragile as frost. Yet they struck him harder than any accusation ever had. He felt something shift inside his carefully ordered mind. He had walked away from failing divisions, from struggling employees, from entire towns that could not keep up with market expectations. Walking away was efficiency. Walking away was strategy. But this was a child asking for something far simpler than profit. She was asking not to be abandoned. Ethan glanced at his phone again. One call would bring a security team with medical kits and blankets. It would also bring questions. How did she get here? Why was she alone? Was there more trouble waiting behind this small body in the woods? The responsible executive inside him argued for procedure. The man kneeling in the dirt felt something else entirely. The wind picked up, cutting through the trees and brushing her hair across her face. Without fully deciding, Ethan shrugged off his wool coat and wrapped it carefully around her thin shoulders, sealing warmth around a life that felt dangerously close to slipping through the cracks of his world. The coat swallowed her small frame, the dark wool nearly reaching her ankles as she trembled beneath it. Ethan slid one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees, surprised by how little she weighed. She felt lighter than the briefcase he carried to board meetings, lighter than the responsibility he claimed to shoulder every day. When he lifted her, she let out a faint breath, but did not resist. Her head rested weakly against his chest, and he could feel the uneven rhythm of her breathing through the thin fabric of her sweatshirt. The sun had dipped lower, streaking the sky in pale orange through the tall pines. He calculated the distance to his SUV, just under a mile if he cut straight through the trees. On flat ground, it would take 15 minutes. Carrying a child with a high fever across uneven forest terrain would take longer. He tightened his grip and began moving carefully uphill boots, pressing into damp earth, scanning for stable footing. Each step forced him to focus not on stock prices or quarterly projections, but on roots rocks and the fragile life in his arms. Halfway up the incline, his phone buzzed with a notification from New York. He ignored it. Another vibration followed. He silenced the device without looking at the screen. The world that usually demanded his attention would have to wait. The girl stirred slightly. "My mom," she murmured, voice barely formed. "I need my mom." Ethan swallowed. "We will find her," he said, though he had no idea who her mother was or where she might be. The promise left his mouth before his logic could stop it. The temperature continued to drop, brushing close to the mid-30s as a colder wind slipped through the valley. He adjusted the coat tighter around her and kept walking. With every careful step toward his vehicle, something inside him shifted from hesitation to decision. This was no longer a situation to delegate. This was his responsibility now, whether he had planned for it or not. The incline grew steeper as Ethan pushed forward, his breathing heavier now, not from exertion alone, but from the awareness that the light was fading faster than he had predicted. The orange glow between the trees thinned into gray, and a sharp wind swept down from the higher ridge, cutting through his shirt, now that his coat was wrapped around Lily. He adjusted his hold, careful to keep her head supported against his shoulder. Her skin still radiated heat, but her hands felt colder, small fingers barely curling against the wool. "Stay with me, Lily," he said quietly, remembering the name she had whispered when he asked. He did not know why hearing it had made everything more real. A name meant history. A name meant someone had once held her and chosen it with hope. The forest floor shifted beneath his boots as loose gravel rolled from under his heel. He steadied himself against a tree trunk, heart pounding once in sharp warning. One wrong step could mean dropping her, and that was not an option. He recalculated again. 800 yards to the clearing where the dirt road began. From there, another 300 yards to the SUV. Normally, it would be nothing. Now it felt like miles. Lily's breathing changed a shallow rhythm that made him glance down. Her eyelids fluttered, then slowly closed again. "Lily," he said more firmly. No response. A ripple of unease spread through his chest. He shifted her slightly and pressed his ear closer to her mouth, listening for steady air. It was there, but faint, but too faint. He picked up his pace despite the uneven terrain, branches brushing against his sleeves, pine needles catching at his trousers. The sky above darkened into early dusk, the temperature slipping toward the low 30s. His phone showed 1 bar of signal. He tried calling emergency services. The line attempted to connect, then dropped into silence. He stopped walking for half a second, staring at the screen as if willpower alone could force it to work. The wind rose again, colder now, and in his arms Lily felt frighteningly still. He forced himself to move again, refusing to let fear freeze him in place. The clearing was close. He could see the faint break in the tree line ahead, where the dirt access road cut through the forest like a narrow scar. His arms burned from the strain muscles unused to carrying anything heavier than a gym weight or a leather portfolio for this long. Lily's head rolled slightly with each step, and he tightened his hold, pressing her closer to his chest to shield her from the wind. "Lily, stay with me," he repeated, his voice steadier than he felt. He shifted her just enough to brush his fingers lightly against her cheek. Her skin was still hot, but her breathing remained shallow, fragile. The sky dimmed into a deep blue-gray, and the temperature dropped another few degrees, hovering near 32. A thin mist began to gather low between the trees, making the path ahead look uncertain. When he finally broke through the last row of pines, relief flashed through him at the sight of the dirt road. His black SUV sat 300 yards away, dark and solid against the fading light. He moved faster now, boots crunching over gravel. Halfway across the clearing, Lily's body went limp in a way that felt different from exhaustion. Too still, he stopped abruptly and lowered to one knee on the cold ground, keeping her cradled carefully in his arms. "Lily," he said, sharper now. No response. A wave of dread surged through him, unfamiliar and overwhelming. He leaned down, listening again for the faint sound of breath. For a moment the world seemed to narrow into silence. Then, barely there, he felt a soft exhale against his collarbone. It was weak, but it was real. He let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. There was no more time to hesitate. He rose quickly and closed the remaining distance to the SUV, unlocking it with trembling fingers and preparing to do whatever it took to keep her breathing. The interior lights of the SUV flickered on as Ethan pulled open the rear door, casting a pale glow over Lily's small, unmoving frame. Warm air would take time to circulate, and time was something he suddenly understood in a completely different way. He laid her carefully across the back seat, keeping his coat wrapped tightly around her body, then rushed to start the engine. The vehicle roared to life, and he immediately turned the heat to its highest setting, directing every vent toward the back. His hands steady in boardrooms and high stakes. Negotiations trembled as he climbed in beside her instead of taking the driver's seat. He placed 2 fingers gently against the side of her neck, the way he had seen in first aid training years ago. There it was. A faint pulse. Too slow. Too weak. "You are not giving up," he said quietly, leaning closer. He remembered fragments of emergency protocol from a corporate safety seminar. Keep her warm. Keep her responsive. Monitor breathing. He rubbed her small hands between his palms, trying to bring circulation back, then adjusted the coat again to seal in the rising heat. Her breathing grew softer, almost imperceptible. "Lily, I need you to hear me," he said, his voice firm but not panicked. "You are safe. Do you understand? You are safe." For a terrifying moment, her chest seemed to pause. The world outside the windshield blurred as a thin layer of frost began forming along the edges of the glass. Ethan leaned down quickly, lowering his ear to her mouth. Silence stretched for one endless second. Then 2. His heart slammed against his ribs louder than the engine. "Lily," he said again, sharper now. He gently tilted her chin upward, ensuring her airway remained open, counting under his breath the way he had once been instructed. Just as dread threatened to overwhelm him, a shallow gasp slipped from her lips, followed by a fragile breath. It was uneven, but it was there. Relief flooded him so suddenly, he had to brace one hand against the seat to steady himself. He grabbed his phone again. One bar of signal flickered back to life. He dialed emergency services, pressing the phone to his ear as if sheer determination could hold the connection. The line began to ring, thin and distant. And then, just as he heard the click of someone answering on the other end, the call cut out into dead silence once more. The silence after the dropped call felt heavier than the cold outside. Ethan stared at the dark screen of his phone for half a second, then forced himself to think instead of panic. The nearest hospital was in Aspen, roughly 22 miles from the edge of his property. Under normal conditions, it would take 35 minutes along the mountain road. Tonight, with the temperature hovering at 30 degrees and patches of early frost forming along shaded curves, it could take longer. Too long. He climbed into the driver's seat, but kept glancing back at Lily through the gap between the seats. The heater now pushed steady warmth into the cabin, slowly softening the chill in the air. Her face looked pale against the dark wool coat wrapped around her. He shifted the vehicle into drive and pressed the accelerator, tires crunching over gravel as he turned onto the narrow access road. The headlights carved two sharp beams through the growing darkness, illuminating drifting mist and the first thin flakes of snow beginning to fall. Snow in October. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Stay with me," he said again, louder now, as if his voice alone could anchor her. In the rearview mirror, he watched for movement, any sign of response. A small cough escaped her lips, weak but real. Relief mixed with urgency. He reached for his phone again and dialed emergency services a second time, placing it on speaker against the dashboard while he drove. The call connected, briefly static, crackling through the line. He shouted his location, giving mile markers and coordinates from memory, voice sharp and precise. The operator began to respond, but the signal fractured once more as the road dipped into a lower valley. The line went dead. He slammed his palm lightly against the steering wheel in frustration, then immediately steadied himself. Anger would not help her. Focus would. He calculated distance again. 15 miles to the main highway, 12 more to the hospital. If he maintained a safe but aggressive speed, he could make it in under 40 minutes. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine responding with controlled power. Behind him in the back seat, Lily's breathing remained faint, a fragile rhythm that now dictated every decision he made. The mountain road curved sharply as Ethan guided the SUV onto the main highway, tires gripping the cold asphalt, while light snow began to dust the windshield. He switched on the wipers, clearing the thin layer of moisture, and increased his speed carefully to 55 miles per hour, balancing urgency with control. The town lights of Aspen shimmered faintly in the distance, still at least 10 miles away. In the rearview mirror, he searched Lily's reflection again. Her small chest rose and fell in uneven intervals, each breath separated by a pause that felt too long. "You are almost there," he said, projecting steadiness he did not feel. The heater filled the cabin with warmth, now fogging the edges of the windows, but her skin still looked pale against the dark coat. He reached back briefly at a red light on the edge of town, brushing his fingers against her hand. It remained small and fragile within his grasp. As he drove, fragments of her earlier words echoed in his mind. "My mom." The fear in that whisper had not been about the cold. It had been about being alone. He tried to imagine what chain of events had led an 8-year-old girl into the middle of his private forest. No child wandered that far without something breaking first. His thoughts drifted unwillingly to the thousands of employees who had once depended on his companies. Over the past year, restructuring had eliminated entire departments across several states. He had signed off on those decisions after reviewing spreadsheets and forecasts, numbers clean and unemotional. Now he wondered about the human side of those columns. Names, families, children waiting at home. A flicker of doubt surfaced where certainty once lived. The hospital sign finally came into view, glowing white against the dark sky. He pulled into the emergency entrance, braking firmly but smoothly, and jumped out before the vehicle fully settled. Cold air rushed in as he opened the back door and lifted Lily once more into his arms. Automatic doors slid open ahead of him, spilling bright fluorescent light onto the pavement. For the first time since he found her, he felt the possibility that she might actually survive this night. But as he carried her inside, he also felt something else rising quietly within him, an uncomfortable question about how many other unseen stories had unfolded beyond the walls of his boardrooms, without him ever stopping to look. The emergency room lights were harsh and unforgiving, revealing every detail Ethan had tried not to study too closely in the forest. Nurses moved quickly, guiding him toward a bed, as a doctor asked precise questions in a calm, practiced tone. How long was she exposed to the cold? Did she lose consciousness? Does she have any known medical conditions? Ethan answered as clearly as he could, aware of how little he actually knew. He did not know her birthday. He did not know her address. He did not even know the last time she had eaten. He only knew the feel of her weight in his arms and the fragile rhythm of her breathing against his chest. The medical team gently took her from him, placing her under warm blankets and attaching monitors that began to beep in steady patterns. The sound of that controlled rhythm steadied him in return. A nurse asked for the child's guardian. Ethan hesitated for the first time since carrying her through the forest. "I found her on my property," he said. She mentioned her mother. The nurse nodded and stepped away to contact local authorities while the doctor continued examining her. Ethan stood back, hands empty, now feeling the sudden absence of her small body as a physical loss. After several long minutes, the doctor approached him. "She has a high fever and signs of severe exhaustion," he explained. "We are stabilizing her temperature and running tests. You brought her in at the right time." Relief washed over Ethan, but it did not feel complete. As hospital staff worked efficiently around the bed, a social worker entered the room holding a tablet. "Her name is Lily Harper," she said after a brief exchange with the intake nurse. "We ran the name through missing persons alerts from earlier this week." She paused, glancing at the screen. Her mother, Sarah Harper, was taken into custody 3 days ago for shoplifting groceries. No prior criminal record. Single parent. Recently unemployed. The words landed slowly, each one pressing against Ethan's chest with growing weight. Recently unemployed, from where he asked, though part of him already feared the answer. The social worker looked up from the tablet. Caldwell Industrial Supply. There was a mass layoff last quarter. The room seemed to narrow despite its bright lights. Ethan felt the air shift around him as the consequences of a signature he barely remembered rippled back in a way he could no longer ignore. The child fighting for stability in that hospital bed was not just a stranger from the forest. She was connected to a decision he had approved with a simple nod in a conference room thousands of miles away. The words Caldwell Industrial Supply echoed in Ethan's mind long after the social worker finished speaking. He stood beside the hospital bed, staring at Lily's small face as monitors traced the fragile proof of her fight to stay alive. 3 days ago, her mother had been arrested for trying to take groceries she could not afford. 3 months ago, Ethan had approved a restructuring plan that eliminated 412 jobs across Colorado facilities, including the warehouse in Glenwood Springs, where Sarah Harper had worked for 6 years. He remembered the presentation clearly. Charts projected on a 40-foot screen. Consultants explaining efficiency ratios. A recommendation to cut underperforming locations to protect shareholder value. He had asked only one question that day. How much would it save? The answer had been $12.8 million annually. He had nodded. The room had applauded the decisiveness. Now the cost stood 5 feet away on a hospital bed that looked too large for her. Lily's eyelashes fluttered slightly as nurses adjusted her intravenous fluids. She looked younger under the bright lights, almost translucent. Ethan moved closer, lowering himself into the chair beside her. He felt the weight of every signature he had ever placed on paper. He had always believed that business required detachment. Emotion complicated strategy. Hard choices built stronger companies. But no spreadsheet had shown him this outcome. No projection model had included an 8-year-old girl wandering into a forest with a fever because her mother had lost steady income, and then her freedom. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, eyes fixed on the steady rise and fall of her chest. For the first time in years, the image of a boardroom felt small. The applause felt hollow. He pictured Sarah Harper sitting alone in a county jail cell, believing she had failed her child. He pictured Lily waiting behind a gas station, hoping someone would fix what had broken. And he understood something that shook him more than the dropped emergency calls or the dark mountain road. His decisions had traveled farther than he ever had. They had reached kitchens he had never entered, schools he had never seen, and now this hospital room. The realization did not arrive as anger or defensiveness. It arrived as clarity. The forest had not been random. It had been consequence. And sitting beside that bed, Ethan Caldwell felt the first undeniable fracture in the identity he had built his entire life around. At dawn, the next morning, Ethan stood outside the Pitkin County Detention Center, the Colorado air sharp against his lungs, far colder than the climate-controlled offices where he usually conducted negotiations. He had not slept. He had watched Lily through the night as her fever slowly dropped under careful medical supervision. When the doctor assured him she was stable for now, he made a decision that felt heavier than any acquisition he had ever pursued. Inside the detention center, the waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. A corrections officer led him to a small visitation area divided by reinforced glass. Moments later, Sarah Harper entered from the opposite side. She looked exhausted, but composed, her brown hair pulled back loosely. Her expression guarded the second she recognized the man sitting across from her. She did not need an introduction. She knew exactly who Ethan Caldwell was. "You own the company that closed the Glenwood warehouse," she said before he could speak. Her voice did not shake. It carried a quiet strength sharpened by disappointment. Ethan nodded once. Yes. The single word felt inadequate. She searched his face as if measuring sincerity against reputation. "My daughter," she said carefully. "Where is she?" Ethan held her gaze. "She is at Aspen Valley Hospital. She had a high fever. She wandered into my property. I found her." Sarah's composure cracked for a brief second, relief flooding her eyes before fear followed. "Is she alive?" "Yes," he said firmly. "She is stable." A long breath escaped her, almost a collapse she forced back into control. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had happened long before this meeting. "I never wanted charity," she said finally. "I wanted work. I worked overtime. I trained new hires. Then one meeting, one email, and it was gone. I tried everything. Applications, interviews. Nothing came through fast enough." Ethan listened without interruption. There was no defense that would not sound hollow. "I am not here to argue numbers," he said quietly. "I am here because your daughter nearly froze alone in the woods. That is not just your burden. It is mine." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in disbelief at hearing responsibility spoken so plainly. For the first time in his career, Ethan Caldwell was not negotiating leverage or protecting assets. He was acknowledging consequence, and the weight of that acknowledgement settled fully between them. The glass between them reflected two very different lives, yet for the first time Ethan did not feel separated by it. Sarah leaned closer to the divider, her voice low but unwavering. "Responsibility does not change what happened," she said. "My daughter slept behind a gas station because I could not give her a bed. I made a mistake trying to feed her. I will face that, but do not pretend this is some accident of fate." Her words did not accuse with volume, they accused with truth. Ethan absorbed each one without interruption. He had spent years surrounded by advisors who softened reality into acceptable language. Now there was no buffer. "You are right," he said slowly. "It is not fate. It is consequence. And I signed the document that started it." The admission hung heavy in the small room. Sarah studied him carefully, searching for performance. "Why are you really here?" she asked. Ethan did not hesitate this time. "Because your daughter is alive and she deserves more than survival. She deserves stability, education, a future that is not one paycheck away from disaster." He placed both hands flat against the metal counter beneath the glass. "I cannot undo the layoff, but I can take responsibility for what comes next. I will arrange legal counsel to review your case immediately. I will cover every medical expense, and when you are released, if you choose to accept it, there will be a position waiting for you within my company. Not as charity, as restitution." Sarah's eyes filled, but she did not look away. "You think money fixes this?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "No, money does not fix it, Accountability begins too. Silence stretched again, different now, less sharp. On the other side of town, Lily was resting in a hospital bed, unaware that her fragile journey through the forest had cracked open a system far larger than she understood. Ethan felt the shift inside him solidify into something irreversible. This was not a public relations move. There were no cameras, no shareholders watching. There was only a mother separated from her child, and a man finally willing to step beyond the safety of numbers. When the guard signaled that visitation time was ending, Sarah pressed her palm gently against the glass. "If you are serious," she said quietly, "prove it." Ethan rose to his feet, meeting her gaze with a steadiness born not from confidence but from commitment. "I will," he replied, and for the first time in his life the promise felt heavier than profit and more urgent than success. By noon that same day, Ethan's private legal team was on a flight from New York to Colorado, instructed to prioritize one case above all others. There were no press releases, no strategic memos crafted for shareholders, only direct orders delivered with a clarity his executives had rarely heard in his voice. At Aspen Valley Hospital, Lily's fever had broken. Her breathing was steadier now, her small frame resting beneath clean white blankets instead of damp pine needles. When she opened her eyes fully for the first time, confusion flickered across her face, before recognition settled in. "The forest," she whispered. Ethan was seated beside her bed, sleeves rolled up, tie removed the image of a corporate titan replaced by a man who had not left her side. "You are safe," he said gently. "You are in a hospital." She studied him as if confirming he was real. "Did you leave?" she asked quietly. The question carried more weight than she knew. "No," he answered. "I did not." Across town, his attorneys met with the district attorney's office presenting documentation of Sarah Harper's employment history, her lack of prior offenses, and evidence of extreme financial hardship following the warehouse closure. They arranged immediate bail and requested expedited review of the charges. By late afternoon, paperwork was moving at a speed usually reserved for high-profile cases. Ethan returned briefly to his company's regional headquarters in Denver via video conference, addressing senior leadership with a tone none of them expected. "We are reinstating community stabilization programs in every state affected by last quarter's layoffs," he said firmly. "Severance packages will be reviewed and expanded. Job placement assistance will be mandatory, not optional, effective immediately." Silence followed on the call, the kind that once signaled obedience but now carried surprise. Back in the hospital room, Lily reached for a cup of water with trembling fingers. Ethan steadied it, for her careful not to overwhelm her with questions. She looked smaller in daylight, but stronger than she had in the forest. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains again, Sarah Harper walked into the hospital under temporary release, escorted only by her attorney. When mother and daughter saw each other, the distance of glass and consequence dissolved into tears and relief. Ethan stepped back, allowing the reunion to fill the room without him. For the first time since he built his empire, he understood that rescue was not an event. It was a responsibility that continued long after the crisis ended. 2 days later, the courtroom in Pitkin County felt smaller than the boardrooms Ethan was used to commanding, yet the stakes felt infinitely larger. Sarah Harper stood beside her attorney as the judge reviewed the case file, now expanded with documentation of her sudden unemployment, financial hardship, and the emergency circumstances surrounding her daughter's hospitalization. The prosecutor, after reviewing the new information and under clear recommendation from the district attorney's office, agreed to reduce the charge to a misdemeanor with time served and mandatory community service. No jail sentence, no permanent record that would shadow every future job application. When the judge finalized the ruling, Sarah exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for months. Ethan remained seated in the back row, not seeking attention, not issuing statements. He simply watched as a system that had nearly crushed a family shifted course. Outside the courthouse, local reporters gathered after word spread that Caldwell Industrial Supply had reinstated over 200 positions across Colorado and expanded severance support for affected employees. Cameras flashed when Ethan stepped forward voluntarily, instead of slipping away. "Last quarter, we made decisions based purely on financial models," he said clearly. "We failed to account for the human cost. That changes now." The statement traveled quickly through news outlets and financial networks, triggering reactions from analysts who questioned his sudden pivot. Share prices dipped briefly before stabilizing as investors recognized long-term community investment could strengthen brand loyalty and workforce stability. Back at the hospital, Lily sat upright in bed, color returning to her cheeks. She swung her legs gently over the side, clutching a stuffed bear a nurse had given her. When Sarah entered the room that afternoon without handcuffs, without an escort, Lily's smile filled the space brighter than any fluorescent light. They embraced carefully, mindful of medical wires, but fully completely. Ethan stood near the window watching snow begin to melt on the mountain peaks under a pale winter sun. He understood that redemption was not applause or headlines. It was policy changes, legal fees paid without expectation of return, and a mother walking free to tuck her daughter into bed again. For the first time, the empire he had built felt less like a fortress and more like a tool, and tools he realized could either cut or build depending on the hand that chose how to use them. Within 3 weeks, the changes that began in a hospital room had reshaped more than one family's future. Caldwell Industrial Supply reopened the Glenwood Springs warehouse on a modified scale, integrating community partnership programs and flexible employment pathways for workers displaced during restructuring. Sarah Harper walked through those doors on her first day back, not as a charity case, but as operations coordinator, a position created to bridge corporate leadership with employee concerns. The title came with a fair salary, full benefits, and a direct reporting line to senior management. Ethan had insisted on that detail. Transparency would no longer be optional. In the boardroom in New York, executives who once measured success purely in quarterly returns now reviewed community impact reports alongside profit margins. Ethan chaired the meeting with a different presence. He no longer spoke only about expansion and acquisition. He spoke about stability, long-term workforce resilience, and the unseen ripple effects of abrupt cuts. Some investors resisted, quietly questioning the cost. Ethan responded with data demonstrating reduced turnover, increased productivity, and stronger regional brand trust. The numbers supported what his conscience had already decided. Back in Aspen, Lily was discharged from the hospital with a clean bill of health and a follow-up appointment scheduled in 2 weeks. She returned not to a gas station parking lot, but to a small furnished apartment secured through a temporary housing partnership funded by Ethan's foundation. The first night there, she slept under thick blankets in her own bed, a nightlight glowing softly beside her. Sarah sat at the kitchen table filling out paperwork for health insurance and school enrollment, pausing occasionally just to listen to the quiet. It was a different kind of silence than the forest. This one felt safe. Ethan visited once, standing awkwardly in the doorway with a box of groceries he had insisted on choosing himself. Lily ran to him without hesitation. "You did not leave," she said again, as if confirming a promise. He smiled, not with pride, but with relief. "No," he replied. "I did not." As winter settled fully over Colorado, snow covered the trails where he had once walked alone seeking escape. Now he understood that isolation had never been peace. Responsibility had found him in the most unexpected place, and instead of resisting it, he had chosen to follow it. And in doing so, he began to build something far stronger than wealth. Spring arrived quietly in the Colorado mountains, melting the last traces of snow along the forest trails and revealing fresh green beneath what had once been frozen ground. On a mild Saturday morning, with the temperature hovering near 60 degrees, Lily walked hand in hand with her mother along a paved path near their apartment complex, her laughter light and unburdened. She had started school again 2 weeks earlier. Her teacher described her as curious, resilient, and surprisingly brave, words no one had used to measure her before. Ethan stood across the street near his parked car, watching from a respectful distance as mother and daughter adjusted to a rhythm that finally felt stable. He had learned that support did not always require proximity. Sometimes it required presence without intrusion. Later that afternoon, he attended a small community gathering at the reopened warehouse. Families toured the facility, children coloring at folding tables, while employees spoke openly with management about scheduling and concerns. The atmosphere felt different from any corporate event he had ever hosted. There were no scripted talking points, only honest conversation. When Lily spotted him, she ran over with the effortless trust only a child can offer. "Mom says we are okay now," she told him proudly. He crouched to her level, meeting her eyes. "You were always okay," he said softly. "You just needed the world to catch up." Sarah approached gratitude in her expression, but strength in her posture. There was no sense of debt between them, only mutual understanding. As the sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the warehouse parking lot, Ethan realized something simple and profound. The most important investment he had ever made did not appear on a balance sheet. It walked beside its mother, laughing in the warm air, alive because someone finally chose not to look away. Several months later, Ethan returned alone to the stretch of forest, where everything had shifted. The air was warmer now, close to 70 degrees sunlight, filtering through full green branches instead of bare October limbs. The dirt trail remained the same, but he did not. He walked without a destination, this time no need for escape, no desire for isolation. When he reached the pine tree where he had first seen a flash of yellow against the earth, he stopped. The ground was covered in soft grass, now no trace of the cold that had once threatened a fragile life. He stood there quietly, hands in his pockets, remembering the hesitation that had almost defined him. He thought about how easily he could have made a phone call and walked away, how efficiently the situation could have been delegated. Instead, he had chosen to kneel in the dirt and pick up responsibility with his own hands. That choice had expanded beyond one night. Caldwell Industrial Supply had implemented permanent community oversight programs. Employee retention had risen by 18%. Local partnerships had strengthened hiring pipelines in towns once labeled expendable. But none of those metrics captured what mattered most. What mattered was that Lily Harper now woke up in a safe apartment, attended third grade regularly, and talked about wanting to become a veterinarian because she loved helping small things survive. Ethan allowed himself a quiet smile at that. The forest breeze moved gently around him, no longer a symbol of indifference, but of change. He understood now that wealth was not power unless it protected something beyond itself. As he turned to walk back toward his vehicle, he felt no need to outrun silence. He had learned how to listen to it, and in listening, he had discovered the kind of legacy that did not require applause. 1 year after that cold October night, the forest stood unchanged in appearance, but forever altered in meaning. Ethan did not visit as an escape anymore. He visited as a reminder. On a bright afternoon in early fall, with the temperature resting at 65 degrees and golden leaves drifting slowly to the ground, he walked the familiar path once more. This time he was not alone. Lily walked a few steps ahead of him, pointing out squirrels darting between trees and explaining with serious focus how animals survived the winter. Her voice carried confidence now, not fragility. Sarah followed beside them, hands tucked into a light jacket, her posture steady, her life rebuilt with dignity rather than dependence. They stopped near the spot where the trees thinned and sunlight broke cleanly through the branches. Lily looked up at Ethan and smiled. "This is where you found me," she said softly, not with fear, but with gratitude. He nodded once. "This is where I found myself too," he replied. She did not fully understand the weight of that sentence, and she did not need to. Children measure moments differently. For her, it was the place where someone stayed. For him, it was the place where profit stopped being the only measure of success. The wind moved gently through the leaves, carrying no urgency, no warning, only calm. Ethan understood now that legacy was not built in glass towers or printed in annual reports. It was built in quiet decisions made when no one was watching. As they turned back toward the trailhead together, sunlight stretching long across the forest floor, he felt certain of one thing. Sometimes the most extraordinary change begins not with ambition, but with the simple refusal to walk away. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next story.